Okay, so this is going to be 3 problems that are all very similar, and they're from 5.7. So this is problem 5.7.17. Directions are to factor, and they give us x to the fourth plus 4x squared minus 9x cubed minus 36x. Okay, so the first thing is whenever you're trying to factor anything, the first thing that you're always going to do is look to see if there's a greatest common factor in the problem. And you can see that in this problem there is a greatest common factor, and that's an x. Okay, so let's go ahead and first of all pull out that x, and we're going to be left with an x cubed, a 4x, and then a minus 9x squared, and a minus 36. Okay, now when I'm looking at the remainder of the inside here, having 4 terms, I want to see, anytime there's 4 terms, we want to see if it will factor by a method called grouping. And what you're doing when you're grouping is you're going to take the first 2 terms and you're going to group them together, and you're going to take the second 2 terms and group them together. And then within those groupings, you're looking for the greatest common factor if there is one. Okay, so I notice in this first grouping between the x cubed and the 4x, there's a GCF of an x. And so I'm going to pull that x out, and I'm going to be left with an x squared and then plus 4. Okay, and then I notice in the second grouping that there's a greatest common factor of a 9. So I'm going to pull out the 9, but anytime the leading term is negative when we're factoring by grouping, we actually want to factor the negative out. So you can see here that we have a negative, and so I'm going to pull out, instead of just pulling out a 9, I'm going to pull out a negative 9. And that's going to leave us with an x squared and then a plus 4. Okay, so when I pull out the negative, it actually is going to change the signs of both of these, and they become positive. So we have x squared and then the plus 4. Now what I notice, and this is the reason for factoring by grouping, whereas I didn't have a greatest common factor on the inside here, after I had factored out my GCF, and I looked at what was left, I didn't have a GCF. But now that I've factored by grouping, I do have a GCF again. I have a x squared plus 4. So I can actually now factor out that x squared plus 4, and I'm left with, in order to get this term back, I will be left with an x, oh, excuse me, yes, I'd be left with an x, and then with this term, I'd be left with a minus 9. Okay, so I'm just checking this real quick because it looks, yeah, okay, so when I pulled out my x squared plus 4, this x right here is coming from what's left. So if I was to multiply this through, I would get this back. And then this minus 9 right here is coming from, when I pull this out here, I'm left with a minus 9. Okay, so that actually would be your answer. And that doesn't factor any further because this x squared plus 4 is not a difference of squares. It looks like it might be, but it's missing the plus, or excuse me, it's missing the minus sign. So if it had a minus sign right here, then it would be difference of squares and it would go further. But it doesn't. So that's that problem. Okay, let's take a look also at problem 5.7, that's a 5.7.43. And it again asks us to factor. This is an s, so s squared plus 5s plus sd plus 5d. Okay, so this is the same thing. It's essentially, we have 4 terms, and there is no greatest common factor to start on this one, but because it's 4 terms, we're going to factor by grouping. And so what I'm going to do is group the first 2 terms together and the second 2 terms together. Okay, and within those groupings, we're going to take a look at if there's a greatest common factor or not. So you notice in the first grouping, the thing that they share in common is an s. That kind of looks like a 5, but it's not. This is an s. Okay, so I'm going to pull out s, and I would be left with an s plus 5 for the first grouping. In the second grouping, the greatest common factor is a d, and so I'm going to pull that out, and I'm going to be left with an s and then a plus 5. Okay, now if we reevaluate, we do see a greatest common factor at this point, and the greatest common factor is this binomial that is this s plus 5. Okay, so I can pull the s plus 5 out, and I'm left with s in order to get that term back, and a plus d in order to get that term back. Okay, so that would be your answer there on that one. And problem 5.7.39. So this is similar to the last two problems, but the only difference is that now we're dealing with a couple of binomials. So we have two binomials here, two of them there. And you can see that we actually do have a greatest common factor of an a plus f. And where it differs is in the previous problems, you know, like for instance in this problem we had our GCF being a binomial, but then the things that were attached to it were monomials. Just one term here. The difference in this problem is here's our GCF, it's a binomial, but what's attached to it is also a binomial. So it just looks different, but it's the same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out the a plus f, and I'm going to think about what do I need right here so that when I multiply I get this back, and I would need the y minus 4. Then I need to add what do I need here to get this term back, pulling out the a plus f, and that would be y plus 9. And then we would just collect like terms on the inside of this parenthesis. We have a plus f. The y and the y gives us 2y. Minus 4 plus 9 gives us a plus 5. Okay, so this right here would be your answer on this one.